every nation fighting this war had a propaganda machine in place by this time. The newspapers telling the people exactly what they needed to hear to be convinced to continue fighting the war. But when that's not enough, it's time to get tough, to get organized, time to establish a Department of Information. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the British made progress in Mesopotamia, clearing the right bank of the Tigris of the enemy near Kut. There was Russian action in the skies of the Eastern Front, skirmishing on the Western Front, and neutral Americans held as prisoners of war in Germany. Here's what followed. It seemed that modern mechanized war was truly coming to Mesopotamia, for starters, as British artillery near Kut overwhelmed any Ottoman counterattacks as the British advanced up the Tigris River towards Kut al-Amara. The Ottomans still held strong positions at Saniyat though, but the Ottoman commander, General Khalil Pasha, had been overconfident in his men's ability to play defense and had sent several divisions to the Persian front. There were now simply not enough troops to withstand General Sir Stanley Maude and the reorganized and revitalized British. Maude had a plan to avoid a direct assault on Saniyat by crossing the Tigris upstream from Kut at the Shumran Bend. This would be really risky, but he prepared well with 3 pontoon bridges made ready and a diversionary attack at Saniyat to pin down the Ottoman reserves. At 5:15 the morning of the 23rd, they attacked. The Ottoman counterfire was fierce, but the British held a bridgehead just long enough to get a pontoon bridge up. When the Ottomans realized what was happening, they evacuated Saniyat to avoid being cut off, and as the week came to an end, they began evacuating Kut itself. And another army was also being pushed back this week on the Western Front, the Germans. On February 17th, the British made gains on both sides of the River Ancre, capturing 761 German soldiers, including 12 officers. During the preliminary artillery bombardment, a British artillery sergeant left the trenches with a telephone, made it to a shell hole for cover in a forward position, and directed the gunfire that destroyed the German barbed wire emplacements. This sort of combat activity continued all week. On the 20th, New Zealand troops penetrated German lines south of Armentières 300 meters, wrecking dugouts and trench works. Southeast of Ypres, the British penetrated 500 meters after desperate fighting, taking 114 prisoners and several machine guns. The steady pressure on the Germans since the beginning of February had yielded results far beyond British Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig's expectations. The Germans had been forced to abandon their front on the Ancre and move to new defenses on Bapaume Ridge. This retreat covered about 5 kilometers, and the British occupied a number of German strongholds with no fighting. The Germans had saved their guns, but had destroyed ammunition dumps with loads of ammunition they couldn't take with them. By this week, it really began to seem like the Germans were up to something, but the foggy weather prevented British airmen from seeing just what it was. The Germans were, in fact, up to something, but if the British can't see what it was, then neither can we for the time being. Something else happened as the week drew to a close that would have huge ramifications later on. Now, over the past couple of weeks, I've talked a lot about the situation between Germany and the United States, especially since the US broke off diplomatic relations between the two. Last month, I mentioned a telegram sent by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico City. The telegram proposed an alliance between Germany and neutral Mexico, whereby Mexico would declare war on the US. Germany would provide huge financial support, and Mexico would receive its former territory in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Pretty serious intrigue, getting one neutral nation to attack another one to prevent that one from going to war with yourself. Anyhow, the German transatlantic telegraph cable had been cut, so Zimmermann used a British-owned cable that President Woodrow Wilson had provided him for negotiations, and he sent the coded telegram. He and the rest of the German command were unaware that Britain had long ago cracked the code and was reading Germany's transatlantic telegrams. This one was a bombshell. If this went public, it would be a propaganda weapon of enormous power. But if it went public, it would also reveal that Britain had cracked the German code. So for a month, British intelligence did nothing until this week, when they found a way to disguise how they'd got the telegram. They'd pretend that they got it from a ship they'd intercepted. On February 23, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour shared the contents with the American ambassador in London, who shared it with U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing, who shared it with President Wilson. Wilson was furious, but willing to keep it a secret until it could have maximum impact. See, handling propaganda had become ever more important as the war continued. Before 1917, nations like France, Britain, and Germany had relied on a fairly easily maintained censorship of the press, had told their people that the war was being won and that the enemy was evil incarnate. Looking back, a lot of it seems ridiculous today. The German story was that they were fighting a defensive war against a gang of nations set on destroying Germany. The British and French stories were just the opposite. They were defending civilization from Germans that wanted to rule the world. Both sides wrote grisly stories of enemy atrocities. You could read stories about Germans cutting the hands off French boys so they could never become soldiers. Or, on the other side, you could read that the Russians were poisoning lakes in East Prussia and that the British and French gouged the eyes out of German prisoners. And everyone lied and manipulated the media. Heck, newspapers ran decade-old photos from Russian pogroms against Jews as new photos of what Germans were doing in Belgium. But things began to change around now. The British government began to target pacifists and conscientious objectors. Pacifist leaders were arrested when addressing assembled workers. This was in reaction to ever-increasing strikes and protests. But it ignored the real causes: long working hours under harsh conditions, the rising cost of living, and lack of food. Strikers were accused of treason, and the governments began to institutionalize their efforts to bring the public to heel. This month in Britain, Prime Minister David Lloyd George established the Department of Information to better control what the public was told. He would soon create the National War Aims Committee, which, despite its name, was created to neutralize domestic dissent. The committee's aim was to persuade workers that there could be no negotiated peace with a barbaric foe. But domestic dissent was not reserved for Western Europe. This week saw the beginning of the Toplica Uprising. Now, this was a Serbian rebellion against Bulgarian rule in occupied territory in the Balkans. Kosta Vojinovic, who had established a resistance last summer, and Kosta Pečanac, who had been flown into the Toplica region to also establish resistance, were the leaders. But the Serbs in general were angry about the denationalization of the Serbian people in occupied territories. Serbian language and traditions were prohibited. Serbian schools had been closed and books had been burned. But now, the Bulgarians announced they would conscript local Serbs into their army, and many conscripts fled to the mountains. It was there that the first armed conflicts between them and the Bulgarians occurred, and from headquarters on Kopaonik, Vojinovic and Pečanac declared the rebellion on February 21st. And that was the week, the British homing in on Kut, also advancing in the west as the Germans pulled back, though that advance was suspiciously easy. Action on the Italian front on the 10th east of Gorizia as Austrian forces managed to enter Italian trenches and take 15 officers and 650 enlisted men prisoner, and the establishment of a new agency for propaganda. It wasn't just Britain, though, that was establishing new agencies and methods of propaganda. France's new propaganda agency focused on spreading tales of German atrocities and that the war was a crusade to save justice and liberty. In Germany, General Erich Ludendorff began a program of instruction in patriotism to persuade the disheartened and hungry German public that they were saving civilization. Here is a telling quote from him about propaganda. Good propaganda must keep well ahead of actual political events. It must act as pacemaker to policy and mold public opinion without appearing to do so. Before political aims are translated into action, the world has to be convinced of their necessity and moral justification. You can guess the long-term results of all this when the real world is abandoned. The propagandists saw to it that whoever lost the war would feel absolutely and irredeemably wronged, and whoever won would have enormous difficulties in dealing with any sense of reason or rationality with the populations of the defeated nations. Another gruesome reality of modern war. A big propaganda tool was actually film, the fairly new mass medium. We made a whole special about propaganda films during the war, and you can check out that right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Giovanna Ramirez. Support our show via Patreon or by buying our official merchandise. You can also like us on Facebook for more awesome World War I facts and even personal facts about me. See you next time.